TopMedTalk.
Well, good evening. Thank you for that warm, wonderful welcome. I'm Desiree, Chappell, host and managing editor of TopMedTalk, and we are here tonight at the Montague in beautiful London, England, for the Edwards Lifesciences Dinner Symposium, The AI Doctor Will See You Now. Now, tonight we're going to be having a great evening of wonderful, in-depth conversation. We're first going to be hearing from Monty Mythen, who is professor at the University College London of Anesthesia and Critical Care, and also editor-in-chief of TopMedTalk. But before that, I do want to let you know we are live streaming this event, so this is going out to the world. And for everyone that's in the room and listening abroad, you can join us, ask those questions. Let us know where you're from, who you are. If you're in the room, please don't hesitate to ask questions as well. Just make sure you grab a mic. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Monty Mythen and invite him up to the stage to give us a short didactic presentation on artificial intelligence.
Oh, thank you. Not all intelligence is artificial, I'm told. So thank you very much indeed for joining in, everyone. Hi, everyone around the world, a loyal audience. I'm going to start by just commenting on some guidelines that were published very recently. Published in JAMA Surgery. They're a new set of guidelines for perioperative care in cardiac surgery from the Enhanced Recovery After Surgery Society. And this is actually a new society specifically about cardiothoracic surgery. So any of you in the room who do, or listening elsewhere, who do cardiothoracic surgery might think, hang on a second, that's sort of ERAS stuff. Isn't that all colorectal? Isn't that all urology, maybe a few joints, etc., etc.? It now seems as though enhanced recovery after surgery is suitable for all patients having all forms of surgery, both elective and emergent. Now, it varies with regards to the type of surgery. There are some subtle variations in the cardiac one. So if you look the paper up, published in JAMA Surgery, May the 4th of 2019, you can find it online. Apparently, the most downloaded paper ever in JAMA Surgery, we're told. So it's been extremely popular. You'll find within it a chart of recommendations that are graded from 1, 2A and lower. And there are about 20 that are in the sort of high-ranking recommendations. And a few of them are cardiac specific. But most of them, when you look closely at them, are the same principles as you see in all enhanced recovery programs. So that is patient preparation. Great emphasis now on prehabilitation, which is what we've been doing today. We've been attending a conference, the Third World Congress of Prehabilitation, sold out here in central London, held at the British Museum, in partnership with Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine and so-called POETS, which is the Perioperative Exercise Training and Testing Society, POETTS. Now, when you look down the list in the paper, you'll see a couple of things that are cardio-specific, but also see emphasized goal-directed therapy. You'll see emphasized smoking cessation and avoiding hazardous alcohol consumption. And further down the list, you'll see prehabilitation. So the idea if we're really going to make a difference to these patients, we have to get them very well prepared for surgery. Hemodynamic management's always been at the heart, excuse the pun, of cardiothoracic surgery. But more recently, we've become very focused on the idea that there's a mean arterial pressure below which we shouldn't allow our patients to go. Now, when I was a youngster brought up doing on-pump bypass, one of the things that shocked me the first time I went into the heart room to see patients on bypass is we would let the mean arterial pressure go down to 40, 35, 30, and you think, whoa, I feel very uncomfortable here. And not all our patients did great. Now we're accepting the fact that in almost all forms of surgery, a mean arterial pressure of about 65 is the lower limit that we should tolerate. Now, very recently, published in the May edition of the British Journal of Anaesthesia, there was an editorial and 4 papers about perioperative blood pressure measurement from the group called POQI, P-O-Q-I, which is the Perioperative Quality Initiative. Now, we're sitting downstairs in the great Russell Room at the Montague on the Gardens Hotel just across from the British Museum, having this sponsored dinner symposium. In this room, 2 EBPOMs ago, a group of alleged international experts gathered for 2 days, to pore over the issue of perioperative blood pressure. They considered the physiology of blood pressure. They considered preoperative blood pressure, intraoperative blood pressure, and postoperative blood pressure. And their findings are published in 4 papers, consensus guidelines, in this edition of the British Journal of Anaesthesia. Now, the physiology paper is, I think, a great read. The first author is Gareth Ackland. You'll recognise some of the other authors on the physiology paper. One of the things it reminded me of is about autoregulation. Now, we all think we know about autoregulation. We know that there's a threshold of blood pressure, a high and a low, that maintains flow constantly in the organs of our body. And normally we think about that with regards to the brain. What I'd sort of forgotten about is the autoregulation point is different for different parts of your body. It varies with age and it varies with your pathophysiology. So the fact that your cerebral autoregulation point might be being maintained doesn't necessarily mean you've maintained your gut and your kidneys. So if you've forgotten about that, as I had, I encourage you to have a look at that physiology paper. It's also made it onto the front cover of the British Journal of Anaesthesia. With regards to the intraoperative paper, I'll come back to the preoperative and postoperative in a second. The intraoperative paper, the key thing that came out of it was that based predominantly on observational data, a mean arterial pressure of less than 65 millimeters of mercury during surgery for as little as 1 minute is associated, and I'll come back to associated in a second, with adverse outcomes. And those adverse outcomes include death, stroke, myocardial infarction, and acute kidney injury. Now, 1 minute below 65 is pretty low risk, but it is an increased risk. Do you ever let a patient get a MAP below 65 for a minute or longer? Possibly. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, the more profound the hypotension and the longer it goes on for, the greater the risk. So if you happen to have a period of, say, I don't know, let's imagine you've induced anaesthesia, you've gone into the operating room, you're waiting for the surgeon to arrive, the patient's draped, and it's below 65 for 10 minutes, the risk is much, much greater. Now, the other bit of news from our perspective, if most of us in the room are anaesthesia providers or critical care or nurses in this space, I don't know if there's any surgeons in the room, is that a lot of the harm, the signal of harm, is between induction of anaesthesia and so-called knife to skin. And there's only 2 people to point the finger at for that. There's the patient, and that seems a bit harsh, okay? And there's the anaesthesia provider who pushed the drugs and waited for the person to arrive. Now, there's only really one interventional study so far that suggests the fact that keeping the blood pressure up is associated with a better outcome. It's not really big enough to definitively say keep the blood pressure up, but the association with the blood pressure being low and harmful is very strong. So the consensus statement here said, pending availability of new evidence, keep the MAP above 65. Now, I can hear you saying, all those other things that are discussed in the paper, what about the baseline blood pressure? How should you keep it up? And how should you keep it up is probably informed by the so-called goal-directed literature. In other words, stick to basic principles, go volume, then flow, then pressure. So still go to the idea of give a few boluses of fluid. If it's not working, give a little bit of squeeze, get the MAP above 65. And use your advanced hemodynamic monitoring to inform that decision-making. Now, preoperatively, there's not a lot of new news. It still seems that there's no absolute level of blood pressure, be it high or low, in a patient who presents electively that should result in delay in surgery. We still kind of go for a systolic of 200 out of the blue to suggest the fact that you're probably not going to get through the system without somebody stopping you getting to elective surgery. But there is no evidence there to suggest that that's actually a harmful decision. It's just kind of pragmatic to say at some stage someone's going to measure your blood pressure and cancel you. So you should probably go and get it sorted out before you get cancelled. Okay. For the post-operative bit, there's a really disturbing paper because one is we had very little evidence to discuss. The evidence we could find was again based on observational data, and when blood pressure has been measured more continuously postoperatively, it seems that hypotension is common and often missed. And the harm signal associated with hypotension the first 1 to 3 days postoperatively is multiple times higher, 3+ times higher, the risk signal, than during the case. So we've really got to do something about that as well. But at the moment, we're really focused on the intraoperative bit and the immediate postoperative bit. Now, in the postoperative paper, there is a cartoon in there, a diagram that was drawn, that shows the challenge we have with our current monitoring cycles. So you'll see in there a graph, if you pull out the paper, that has the period of time, immediate postoperative period, day 1, day 2 and beyond. Then it has 3 lines on it. It has a green line, which is the line of hope. It has the blue line, which is the line of something that might happen soon. And it has the yellow line, which is the line of today. And the yellow line represents the fact that unless you're going back to a high dependency unit or an intensive care unit, it's not going to be long until your blood pressure is not being measured very often at all. Whereas when now, in some papers published recently, they've used more modern technology, devices that allow more continuous blood pressure measurement, that you can get to having continuous blood pressure measurement out to about day 1 and multiple episodes of serious hypotension are being detected. We hope it won't be that long until there are sensors available, microsensors, transmitting sensors. They're already being tested at the moment that will allow continuous blood pressure measurement. My final point I want to make is the point about this evening's discussion. So we kind of all would probably accept the fact that hypotension is bad for our patients. We'd kind of like the idea that we could have continuous non-invasive blood pressure measurement more easily, more readily available, and more affordable. But what about going one stage further? What if we could predict hypotension? If 1 minute of a mean arterial pressure below 65 is bad for you, you're going to have to be pretty focused on what's going on around you to get in there at a point whereby you can stop that little bit of transient hypotension going on for a minute. So what if there was a technology available that told you, based on analysing all the characteristics of the arterial waveform and more, that it's highly likely that your patient that you're looking after will have a hypotensive episode in the next 2, 5, 10, 15 minutes? Well, now there's a new technology which has been developed by Edwards Lifesciences, and one of the, let's call him inventors, is in the room tonight. We'll come to him for a conversation in the break. And it's called HPI. We'll tell you what HPI is later. But I've got up for those in the room. I've shown up an article from the Wall Street Journal, published relatively recently, called "The AI Doctor Will See You Now." So it's in the Wall Street Journal, so it must be true. It's talking about the very few artificial intelligence technologies, machine learning, that have been approved to date. And the particular one it's talking about is the Acumen technology, the Hypotension Prediction Index from Edwards Lifesciences. It has on the new screen, this is approved now. It's been approved in Europe for coming on for 2 years now. It was approved by the FDA in the USA in October last year. The monitoring device now has a number on it, which goes from 0 to 100. The higher the number, this HPI number, that we'll come back to in detail after the break, the greater the likelihood that your patient is going to have a hypotensive episode. And the predictive characteristics seem quite extraordinary. As it starts to rise, let's imagine it's going on at about 10 or so, the number increases, and as it increases, it's saying the likelihood of hypotension is growing. It's a bit like a weather predictor. It gets up to 50%. It says, it might rain, it might not rain. But if I was you, I'd think hard about whether you think it's not going to rain, because there's a 50% chance it is going to rain. When it goes up to 70, it says, it's probably going to rain. Yeah. By the time you get to 85, it's saying, it's going to rain! So we'll come back to that after the break. So that's HPI. So that's the tee up. I want you to take a break now. Those of you at home, go and put the kettle on, whatever you do. Those in the room, take a quick bio break, and then top your glasses up, whatever you want to do. And in 5 minutes' time, we'll come back and have a good chat with our special guest, one of the developers of HPI. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us again at the Edwards Lifesciences Dinner Symposium here at the Montague on the Gardens in London, England for the AI Doctor Will See You Now. I'm Desiree Chappell, managing editor and host of TopMedTalk and also a CRNA from Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm joined by Monty Mythen, professor of anesthesia and critical care at the University College London. Hello, Monty. How are you?
Hi, Desiree. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the didactic portion. Earlier, you gave us a great introduction on hypotension in the OR, which was very, very interesting, knowing being in the OR myself and seeing the mean arterial pressure and kind of guidance on that. So I think that's great, as well as HPI and artificial intelligence utilizing it in the OR.
So would you ever have let the map go below 65?
Every time you say that.
Let's rephrase that question. Do you know of anyone who may have ever let the map go below 65? Okay.
Occasionally I'm in, for a little while.
Hang on a second. This gentleman wants to join us. Can you identify yourself, sir, for everyone listening from around the world?
Certainly. I'm Adrian Sultana from Sydney, Australia. Some surgeons won't operate above a mean of 65.
Good point. Touche.
That is an excellent point.
Thank you so much. I wasn't going to say it.
What are we going to do about that? That's a great first question or comment. We discussed that quite a lot in the round table, and it's a recurring question. And I think the important thing is that the surgeons who want to keep the map below 65, and there are times when you have to keep the map below 65 to do certain surgical interventions. I think the really important thing is to make sure that they're fully informed about the current literature. Because my experience is that not necessarily is fully informed about where the literature has gone recently. And those who are fully informed are starting to rethink that. Because it's an interesting position if somebody was to have an adverse postoperative event. If they were not aware of the literature and still took that action, I think they're on pretty thin ice. And we've got another person waving an arm at me here. No, whoa. Introduce yourself, please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Corey Springman. I'm a perioperative medicine fellow from Duke University. So when these conversations come up, though, you're in the OR, the surgeon's on the other side of the drape, they're drop the blood pressure below 65. And then that's when you're like, that's not a good time to talk about the literature.
No, it's not. No, you can't be quoting literature. But I do have to say, my personal practice, since I have been talking a lot more about this and getting more into the literature, I actually do have a lot more conversations than I've ever had before. And now it is a conversation. It's just not a physician telling me, or a surgeon telling me you need to drop the blood pressure. It's more of a discussion and has really improved communication between me and the surgeon.
Yeah, because I'm guessing most of us kind of know where our surgical colleagues stand on this. So I think you have to have you have to have a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Someone has to have the cup of coffee and say, can we just have a little chat about the fact the literature is in a different place?
Yeah.
And if at the end of that they still feel very, very strongly, then you have to work out where you stand on. You might be made to do the case, or you might have a choice.
So if you're joining us from home or wherever you are, please don't hesitate. Join us by slido.com. This question, or take this next question from the audience. So yes, sir, please introduce yourself.
Or comment.
Hi, I'm Oliver David. I'm from Adelaide, South Australia. I once read in an old anaesthetic textbook that hypotensive anaesthesia was to make the impossible possible, not to make the difficult easy. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's the comment. Is there are certain situations where I think everyone agrees that the transient as possible, periods of low blood pressure may be essential to complete certain surgical procedures. But that does not include, I like my patient having a knee replacement to have no blood pressure for hours, because I think that results in less bleeding.
Shoulder.
But these are complex conversations. My experience is that many surgeons have significantly moved to say, well, a map of 65 is okay. What I don't want is intermittently to have a systolic of 160. Right. So important conversations to have once the surgeons are fully informed, because at the end of the day, the consensus is based largely on observational data. It's not based on large interventional trials, and this may well change over time. So I think all we can do is discuss current consensus opinion and observational data. Great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. If you have another question, please don't hesitate. Oh, we have one other question right here.
Magdalena, University of Gdańsk. I'd like to ask whether the core body temperature has been taken into account when the 65 millimeters of mercury threshold was calculated.
I think the reasonable answer to that is no. No. From the point of view of, I do not believe it's been adjusted from the point of view of the potential that there may be some cerebroprotection by being slightly colder. If anyone's listening who believes that to be wrong, then please do let us know. Put a message in or a question in, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I'm going to suggest that we get our special guest up.
That's it. Absolutely. So we have a very special guest from Edwards Lifesciences who we're going to talk and do a deeper dive into the HPI, and it's Feras Hatib. Feras, why don't you join us up here,
Round
please?
of applause for Feras.
Yes, please.
Do you want to wander around or do you want to take a stool for a second?
Up to you.
Let's have a stool for
You
a
can
moment.
have a stool. You can sit there, and I'll stand in. And if you guys have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. So, Monty, we were talking. You started out by talking a little bit about HPI. Feras, can you tell us about HPI? What exactly that is?
HPI, as we call it, means hypotension prediction index. So, as Monty mentioned, it shows you basically the probability of hypotension happening in the next 15 minutes, from few minutes to 15 minutes, depending on how fast the hypotension is developing physiologically at that moment.
Okay. So we'll come back to you in just 1 second. Monty, I know that you have worked a little bit with this in the laboratory,
Yep.
in the lab. And some of the stories that you have told me about the profound effects of hypotension on everything, including the brain, has been very interesting. So can you give us a little bit about what you've seen in the lab with how this works?
Well, if I back up a little bit from that, I think everyone's initial response who is into physiology and thinks that they look after their patients very, very closely is, this isn't going to tell me anything I don't know or can't predict already. So we have a number of investigators in Europe and a couple in particular in the UK who've been very exposed to HPI now. And they've all seemed to have been converts to the fact that despite their prejudice to say there's nothing this is going to do that is going to make me believe that it can outperform me as predicting hypotension. So my experience from being exposed to it from a similar position is that it definitely seems to work. It seems to be able to, and we'll come into a second as to what goes into the algorithms to make it do its prediction. No matter how hard you concentrate, no matter what you're looking for, it seems to be able to detect things like subtle bleeding, for example, that you have no chance of detecting yourself unless you happen to be privileged to be able to see the subtle bleeding. So I think we should probably ask Feras as to what's in the secret sauce. What's in the black box? How did you make this thing?
Yeah. So Feras, you're from Edwards. So tell us a little bit about your background there, and then tell us about that.
Yes, the first part of my career I spent in academia, so about 20 years, pursuing a purely research type of career. And then at some point I decided to switch to the industry, where my type of area, my type of field has been developing very fast, right? So that type of field, which is mostly instrumentation and sensors and signal processing and algorithms, at that time I was moving from academia into the industry. So I moved with the field. So so I have been working in Edwards for 16 years, and right now I'm in charge of the signal processing and algorithms department within the R&D organization in Edwards. So
how did you? People say it's based on machine learning and artificial intelligence. Where did the machine learning take place, and how did you end up generating this number?
Yeah, I could explain a little bit. So basically, the technology, the algorithm is based. What the algorithm tries to do is to detect failure of the compensatory mechanisms that exist in the arterial or cardiovascular system that maintain blood pressure stable. So detection of failure of those compensatory mechanisms that lead into hypotension. So in the cardiovascular system, there are physiological mechanisms that counterbalance each other to maintain blood pressure stable. And those mechanisms, you guys know, it's preload, afterload, and contractility, right? Based on physiological concepts like baroreflex control, right? So all these compensatory mechanisms try to counterbalance each other to maintain blood pressure stable. And these counterbalances create an extremely complex, so basically create complexity in the signal and variabilities in the signals, and also complex cross-dynamic links between different physiological cardiovascular parameters. So those dynamic links and physiological associations between those parameters created by the compensatory mechanisms, they are multidimensional, right? And they are nonlinear. So it's impossible to detect those or to measure those with simple techniques. So this is why we used machine learning and let the models learn from the data itself on what happens to those physiological mechanisms prior to hypotension.
So if I can repackage that, when I've seen you present the very detailed presentations, you look at all different aspects of the arterial waveform, for example. So the upstroke, the point of the dichrotic notch, the downslope, how wide the signal is, and the RR interval, for example. And there's loads of other variables that you can tell us the number of variables in a second. And the computer has learned over time to say that when these very subtle things change that the human eye can't see, the probability of hypotension is rising and rising. Now, how many, when you filtered it down to the key variables, well, let's start with a big number. How many variables did you look at to begin with? What was the
so from the arterial pressure waveform, we extract different variables, which in the machine learning area, they're called features. Yep. So we featureize the waveform, right? So we extract features related to contractility, related to vascular impedance, related to afterload, to preload, etc. We extract parameters like cardiac output and others using pulse contour techniques. And then we are not interested in those simple parameters. What we're interested is in their interactions, right? So we do all the combinatorial parameters between them, and we ended up basically with 2.6 million features for every cardiac cycle. So we do cardiac cycle by cardiac cycle. Well, this is why we use machine learning.
That's a big piece of paper.
Yeah. This is why we use machine learning, because we don't know which one of them changed prior to hypotension, right? Which one of them are relevant to hypotension, right? So we use those artificial intelligence techniques to what we call narrow down the space.
So you got 2.6 million features, and then you filter that down to more critical sets.
Yeah. Yep. So that's called narrowing down the dimensions. So at the end, we end up, after training the model on hundreds of millions of cardiac cycles from patients, we end up with only 23 features. Most of them are complex, so they don't make sense clinically, right? But these are the things that, the associations that happens prior to hypotension.
And typical machine learning processes, you take a historical data set, very detailed historical data set, where you have the signal and you have the outcome, which is the hypotension. You learn from that, and then you verify by looking forward. Is that correct?
Yes. So the algorithm is not an active learning algorithm, so it's not learning from the current patient.
Yes.
It was trained on historical data. So you have the patients who had hypotension, or the period of times where hypotension happened, and then the period of times where the patient was stable. And then based on these two, you make the algorithm, the model, learn what happened in those data.
What I've seen for the approval is it changes from white color to a red color at an HPI of 85. The top is 100. And that's when it's saying hypotension is imminent. It's very highly likely to happen. But my experience in a highly controlled situation is it's the journey to that 85 that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's when it says there's a 35, let's call it a percent, I know we're not supposed to, but there's a 35 out of 100, not to be called a percentage, for some reason I don't understand, chance that things are going to happen. So that prompts you to turn around and say, well, I wonder what's causing that then. And usually when you do look around, you get a clue as to what might be causing it. It's usually something simple, like a little bit more blood on the swabs than you thought might be there, someone leaning on something, etc., etc. And then when you discover that, the things you do are the usual things you do, which is preload, afterload contractility. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at the data or in those animal studies, HPI starts rising very, very early, where nothing else is changing, right? The reason we chose 85 was because purely for regulatory reasons.
Yes.
Just because above 85, the specificity was like 99%. So hypotension happens for sure, right? When you see the pop-up.
And the science behind this, sorry to interrupt, but the science behind this and the development and everything that goes into developing that number has all been published. You've got a first author publication in one of our famous anesthesia journals relatively recently. Is that correct?
Yes, it has been published in Anesthesiology 2018, so last year. And with the publication, you have supplemental material. And in that material, we describe the algorithm in quite detail.
So it's not a black box.
Yeah.
The science that has gone into developing the number is all published in there. And then there's more recent publications like the Dual Center study that was published in Anesthesia and Analgesia, which answers all of our sort of questions about surely other things are just as predictive.
Yeah.
Right. So great. Now we should open up to the audience to ask if they want further explanations and or go to Slido. Desiree.
Yeah. Does anybody have a question in the room right now?
Here's your chance to ask the science team. I'll get to you, sir. Here we go. Wait a second, please.
Yeah. Anything?
Makarand Lotlikar, Anesthetist Healing Hospital. The 22 variables that you have mentioned, how many of them can you get from an arterial trace alone?
They are all from the arterial pressure waveform. We don't have any supplemental material, other variables coming into the algorithm, except the patient's age, gender, height, and weight, which are part of our cardiac output computation.
And that's part of where the direction of travel, isn't it? We can all anticipate that the more variables we could draw in from elsewhere and other signals that perhaps your company's acquired recently, the greater the predictive ability may get.
Right.
We have another question?
Another question. Again, Corey Springman from Duke Hospital. Does the algorithm incorporate arrhythmias as well as vasoactive medication titrations or input-output that the patient may undergo, such not only intraoperatively but maybe even postoperatively? Because hopefully this monitor would be able to help not only predict hypotension within the OR but even postoperatively to then help continue managing patient care.
So first, heart rate is not part of the model because the error under the curve for heart rate to recognize hypotension was 50-50, so it's not. You'll be surprised how well this algorithm works during arrhythmia and AFib and stuff like that because it has 23 variables and they compensate each other. So while you could see variability in the individual parameters, the parameter itself. It's really very stable, and then vasoactive drugs were not part of the development. So we developed from a physiology point of view whether or not the patient got vasoactive drug that impacts basically that physiology. But it's really nice because as soon as you give vasoactive drug, and if that drug works, HPI goes down right away. If it works, if it's not the right intervention, maybe this
then it won't work.
It's not going to. So it will still show you a high probability of hypotension.
Yeah. Oh, we have another question back here.
It's Nicole Papen-Botterhuis from Maxima Medical Center in the Netherlands. I have a question about the variables. Did you also add the race of people into the mix?
Yeah, happy to hear a question from the Netherlands. That's where we developed part of the HPI on patients at AMC in Amsterdam. No, we didn't take the patient race into consideration.
Do you think it doesn't matter?
I don't know. Why
Could
would
it be a
matter?
risk? Could it be a risk for patients if Chinese patients are being helped while it was excluded from the research, perhaps?
Yeah, actually, China usually requests data, that their regulatory agencies request data from Chinese patients, right? They have to be Chinese. And we provided that data to them, pending the approval for this device. Our analysis did not specifically for between white, right? So European descent people in U.S. and Asians in the U.S., we didn't see a difference, right? Now we're doing a study in China itself, right? Because we did the analysis on Asian patients in the U.S., so American Asian. Maybe in China we may see difference. We have to see. We haven't done other races like black or other races in this
enough
study.
women in the study?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It's
Thank you very much. Good question. We have another question here. Be sure if you're on Slido.com to answer our poll too. We're going to go to that in just a second.
Sure. My name's Sam Miranda. I'm an anaesthetic graduate at UCLH. It's just taking the last question a bit further, actually. What were the characteristics of the patient group you analysed? How many patients did you analyse? And also, did you analyse anyone with disordered physiology, like critically ill patients, as they respond differently to, hypertension and anaesthesia?
So we developed this using about 1,300 patients. Most of them, both patients from ICU, so intensive care unit patients, both post-surgical types, right? Post-general surgery or post-cardiac surgery. So mostly patients who got arterial lines, so ASA 3 and higher. And then we had also medical ICU patients, so patients with septic shock, with sepsis, with cardiogenic shock, so very sick patients in the ICU. And also we have also the OR group, so OR patients who get usually arterial lines again, cardiac, major abdominal, orthopedic, vascular, so those type of patients that went to the model. But I want to mention one thing. It's not about the number of patients. It's about, are you covering your distribution correctly, right? If you catch all your corner cases, then you could develop with very few patients. The problem is that we don't know, right? So that's why we try to increase the number of patients.
Yeah, that's a good question. Another question here in the back of the room.
Hello, hi there. My name's Anas. I'm an anaesthetic registrar at UCH. With regards to outcome measures such as mortality, morbidity, I appreciate preventing hypertension, or rather having hypertension in of itself can have an increase in mortality, morbidity. I was wondering, has there been an investigation into has it actually reduced it using this particular algorithm?
So we don't have those type of outcome studies yet. There was a small study by Michael Sanders, a group from Germany, who showed that using HPI you could significantly reduce, if not eliminate, hypotension in surgical patients. But that has not been tied to actual income improvements at this point.
I think one of the regular discussion points about, and why I think the company has done a very sensible job in approaching this with caution, is that when we discuss, the fact that hypotension may be associated with harm, we know there's numerous different ways you can make the blood pressure go up. And some of those may be a good idea, and some of those may be a bad idea. And in particular, we're relatively fearful as a community of seeing the excessive use of vasopressors in relatively hypovolemic patients, because we're fairly certain that will cause more harm than good. So I think at the moment it's been a very controlled release into sort of super users, if we can put it that way, to recognise the fact that this is not going to be an easy journey. I think we have to learn by doing, and we have to learn by doing cautiously. And therefore, I think that's why not everyone, even though we're 2 years into it, is being overwhelmed with the opportunity to get into HPI. So I think enthusiasts who want to put their hand up and say, I really want to work to understand what we might do with this, I think, are going to be welcomed. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. So, we have another question back here.
So I'm Chris from Rio, Brazil. Yeah. So as it's artificial intelligence, so you are going to learn with what it's going on while doing the surgery or postoperative care. How are these data coming to you and could improve that? So she asked about Chinese, but I'm really interested in Afro-American descendants because they got different types of response for controlling hypertension. Yeah, they do behave different. Yeah, and also for cardiac rhythms, And so how are we, doctors, could help you develop that to go better each day, because that's so fantastic what you're showing us.
Well, we always partner with clinicians in developing this technology. Actually, this HPI, the basic concept, the basic idea came from clinicians, right? From Pittsburgh. So we're always working with clinicians, to collect the data, very important to annotate the data, right? That's critical, to do those developments. And so I'm not sure if the race makes difference, physiological difference, because it's working equally good on pigs. So I don't know. But if you guys think that there could be different hypotension levels for different races, maybe that should be something that we need to look at.
Yeah, all good points.
Yeah.
Oh, one more question from the audience, and we'll get to Slido.
Magdalena, Medical University of Gdańsk. I'd like to ask whether there are special algorithms intended for patients who take some medications before operations. Is that included in an algorithm?
We didn't take that into the algorithm into consideration, but I would assume that some of the patients who came into the surgery of the database probably had some medication. Yeah, we didn't.
But one would guess the majority for the cohorts you looked at
would be on. Yeah. So that takes us to our first question in Slido. I think that would be good. And make sure that if you see a question that you like, you can vote it up. Please do that. Can you clarify the limitations of HPI, such as the EA-Dyne and DPT, which is getting pretty in-depth with some of that verbiage there?
Can we take that in two sections, Desiree?
Yes.
Because we should probably explain what EA-Dyne and DPDT are first.
Exactly.
So if I may, Feras, that's Please. On the so-called secondary screen, so I've learnt this now by using this quite a lot, there are two variables that may be less familiar to people. DPDT, which I'm guessing most people are familiar with that. That is, the upstroke on the arterial line quantified in terms of the acceleration of the slope. So we'd be familiar with that as a surrogate measure of contractility. EA-Dyne, I was less familiar with, and I struggled with it for a while because I thought it was EA elastance measured in the units dyne, D-Y-N-E. But it's not. It's dynamic elastance, which is the ratio of pulse pressure variation and stroke volume variation. So it's a ratio. So if that ratio is 1.0, it means that a preload responsive patient, and this is tricky at 8:20 in the evening after a long day, if it's 1.0, you can't make a call. But if it's greater than 1, let's say 1.2, for example, it means that a fluid bolus, because they're fluid responsive, will produce a rise in blood pressure. If it's 0.8, for example, it means a fluid bolus, which may still be needed, may produce an increase in stroke volume, but it won't produce an increase in blood pressure. Now, it took me a while to get my head around that. It's a very cool number. Is that about right?
Yeah, you explained it 100% correct.
So I suggest we come back to that one another day. But neither of those are limitations, are they? They're potential benefits. What are the limitations, which is the first question?
Well, first to emphasize, EA-Dyne and DPDT are not part of HPI. It's not part of the predictor. Those are additional parameters that we provide on the secondary screen. The main limitation of the HPI is that it cannot predict if the surgeon does something to cause hypotension rapidly, like clamping of a vessel, or right. That's
It can't predict. We might be able to predict. Oops, we might be better at that.
What's going on up there?
There we go. Oops, but it can't predict. Oops, no.
Yeah.
But the traditional limitations of dynamic parameters such as SVB.
So the limitation. So the DPDT is associated very strongly with the left ventricular contractility. So the DPDT number per se, it's not important. The absolute number, because different people could have different DPDTs. But the change in DPDT is always associated with the change in contractility, right? And we published a paper about it on animal models comparing DPDT to the intraventricular contractility measured with intraventricular catheters.
But the limitations we'd be familiar with stroke volume variation, pulse pressure variation, things like tidal breath size or arrhythmias, they're not in play here. They're not
because they cancels out, because it's a ratio. So the elastance would work in spontaneous breathing, in open chest situations, etc. The only thing is like DPDT, it has been reported, there are papers about that. In some situations of severe vasoplegia, like severe vasodilation, like in septic shock, DPDT may not be reliable in measuring or assessing contractility.
Got you.
But again, it's not very clear. So it's...
All right. So our question here was, how much personal training is required prior to implementation into practice of utilizing HPI, I would assume?
I don't really know. I don't know you guys.
I've talked to, and we've interviewed a number of practitioners who've taken different approaches to introducing it into their organizations. Yeah. Some people have kept it as a personal experience while they learn about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities associated with the new technology. Some people have said they took everyone in the room and explained to them roughly how it worked and said, go at it. And they've reported very favourable experiences using that approach as well. So I don't think there's a direct answer to that question yet.
Yeah, it just doesn't see the learning curve is not necessarily steep for it.
I think you have to understand what it's telling you. The risk, I mean, at the room we were looking at a picture of it, that the risk is because it's a number on the screen that looks like a physiological variable, is that people think, because it's a red number that says 96, that's a bit like a saturation or something, is that people think it's a physiological variable that you should treat. Now, by giving common treatments, you can make the number change. That isn't necessarily doing the right thing, because it's not a physiological variable. It's a number that predicts the likelihood that hypotension may happen.
And what I've seen from clinicians doing is that, after using HPI for a little bit, they turn on their secondary screen and they make the secondary screen their primary screen. So they like to be on that screen all the time.
And the secondary screen is the treatment kind of recommendations.
Yeah. But they have it as a primary screen now, right?
Yeah.
And,
So
let's rattle through these, sure.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Rapid fire. So from Krista, are there age limits? Is this validated in children?
No, unfortunately not validated in children. And basically our basic hemodynamic technology like FlowTrack, it's not validated for it's not validated for pediatrics.
The age is there it's adults
18.
Then is it 18? And any upper age limit for the approval?
No upper,
Okay. And for Hassan, have you been able to measure how the accuracy of the algorithm improves relative to the size of the sample or data set?
So I think what they're saying there is you've worked with a particular size data set, which is by traditional evaluations big and deemed big enough by the regulators. Do you think it will get better as you get bigger and bigger data sets?
Get more information.
At this point, I think we reached our maximum.
You maxed out.
So it's because, we have sensitivities and specificities in the 90s. Improving that by a percentage or half a percentage would be extremely difficult at this point. So adding data is not going to help.
Okay. And we're coming up. We just have a couple more questions. So if there's anyone in the room that would like to ask a question, please don't hesitate. The question next is, which patients do you feel will benefit the most from AI? Intraoperative, or postoperative, or both? And I would expand that out to the types of patients too.
I my belief is we need to do the intraoperative bit, and we need to do it now. Mm-hmm. And shame on us that the observational data says that we're not paying as much attention as we think we are. I think the big opportunity is post-operative. Because I think that's where a lot of the harm happens. The principal first opportunity, I think, is more readily available, robust, reliable, continuous, non-invasive blood pressure measurement. Yeah. And we're getting much closer to that. Then I think the AI will help a lot, is my hunch. But, that's opinion uncontaminated by data, as they say. But I think from the basis of the fact that the harm signal is much greater, and the AI, I think, will help us to filter out the false positive, false negative problem of lots of alarms going off the whole time. Feras, what do you think?
On my side, looking at data, and I've looked at a lot of data, I think that we see hypotension in all kinds of patients, in all kinds of sites, consistently with the same frequency. So I would say any patient who gets arterial lines need to be monitored with this technology because they have hypotension, right? And currently, actually, as of last week, this technology is available with our non-invasive sensor in Europe. They're doing focused release now with specific.
Okay, so the ClearSight type of technology.
Yeah, it's already
a little blood
available
pressure
in
the
Europe.
cuff that goes on the
You
finger.
can now have you can have HPI related to
Europe,
that. Well, that's a big jump forward. Europe got there first.
Yeah.
I think we're still in Europe. I haven't checked the news
Today? Did you check the news today?
Just a small question. Transitioning from
Who are you, ma'am? I know that we know who you are in the room.
Corey Springman again from Duke Hospital. Transitioning from intraoperative to postoperative, would you have to reevaluate a baseline for the HPI? Is it intraoperative, postoperative every 24 hours? There's a lot of monitors that need zeroing and whatnot.
No, you could either disconnect it or keep it running. It doesn't, it's not going to change. It's
the baseline was baseline.
You could, if you need to stop the monitoring, while the patient is transitioned, you could do that. Yeah.
Couple more questions to roll through. Who has been most interested to adopt AI within their practice? So are we talking anesthesiologists, surgeons?
At this point, both anesthesiologists and intensivists.
Intensivists?
Intensivists as well. Are extremely interested in adopting.
So you're seeing quite a bit in the ICU.
HPI
then.
and OR.
Yeah.
Right, they're both interested. We have not been talking to surgeons at this point. Yeah.
Okay. Now, many devices that are used in pediatrics are not validated. Do you think it may be applicable in children, even though it hasn't been validated?
Yeah, it may.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, especially older pediatrics towards the 18.
Yeah, a little bit older.
Neonates, I don't know. Right.
Next one's from Nicole Papen. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing your surname incorrectly there. I think you touched on this before. For us, the algorithm, it says, is the algorithm still learning truly AI or more a big data approach? It's AI, but based on a historical data set. It's not learning on the patient in front of you.
No, it's not an active learning algorithm.
That's good. Okay. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Can you clarify the limitations of, we did that one.
Yep.
Can all disciplines plan on using this information? Example, general practitioners, anesthesiologists, advanced practitioners, and nurses utilize the information.
Do you think there'll be any limits in the future?
I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, the algorithm is physiological, so it's based on physiology. So it should not depend on
so if you present to your general practitioner with a bad case of the flu and they put it on in sometime in the future and say your HPI is elevated, they might take a different approach. It's highly speculative, all of that. But one can imagine they would have very broad use over time.
Very, very broad. Two more questions. Can this information help predict post-CPD or cardiopulmonary bypass separation refractory hypotension?
There's a challenge with some patients come off cardiopulmonary bypass and they then have very low blood pressure once they come off. But I think the arterial line would have to be back in play before you could use it.
Yeah, you cannot predict during the bypass.
Yeah. As we stand at the moment.
Yeah.
Right. And we kind of answered the next one about vasoactive medications and kind of.
I like this next question.
I was just going to say, I think this is a wonderful question to finish on. All right, Feras, what makes you happy?
Well, I've attended many cases with surgeons, with anesthesiologists, where I see how they prevented hypotension using HPI in the Cleveland Clinic specifically. That makes me happy. Right?
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I love it. I love it. It's validating what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
So, Monty, what makes you happy?
What makes me happy? I don't think I should answer that right.
Can I say London pride? And all right. So we're going to.
This is making me happy.
This is making me happy. It's great. Thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Let me just mention to you, EBPOM Dingle. From October the 7th through till the 9th, the 22nd Current Controversies in Anesthesia and Perioperative Medicine and SIAA Autumn Congress will be live from Dingle Island, where it will be streamed around the world right to your home. EBPOM Dingle has a certain flavour about it. It's one of the conferences you'll have frequently heard guests and contributors on TopMedTalk referred to in hallowed terms. This is an incredible opportunity for you to be able to go there and enjoy every aspect of EBPOM Dingle that makes it so special. We've got the socialising covered, we've got all of the latest and greatest information, and we've got all of the fun you expect from an EBPOM conference. Check out ebpom.org. I'll see you there.